This is Profound Conversations, a space where we engage in a discussion about things that are impacting our community. When we talk about impact, we have to talk about legends, people who have really done a variety of things that have made a difference. And that's what we bring to this particular space. And this person today, Dr. Lawson, William Lawson, is indeed that person. I can talk about the accolades that appear on Amazon when we talk about his latest book entitled African American Health: Peeling Back the Layers for a Vision of the Future. I can mention what they say about him and his professorship at and his serving at George Washington University and serving at Howard University and serving at these various institutions that I mentioned, University of Maryland. He has held faculty positions at a variety of esteemed institutions throughout his career. However, my introduction to him was in the community in Washington, D.C. when I was working on my doctoral degree. And I was working on a dissertation, and I came across Dr. Lawson. And his work, his prophetic voice into how to address mental health issues and concerns of a population were astounding. And I'm just deeply honored to be able to have this conversation with him today, because he has helped to shape and facilitate a lot of the work that I do, because we were in the community. I was learning from him about how to work with people in the community who are primarily African American. He has been actively engaged in the National Medical Association, right? It is the collective voice of African American physicians, a leading voice in the community of Black folks who are making a difference to those that have been despised, those that have been dispossessed and disinherited. He has been an advocate for populations. He's been a researcher. He has just been actively engaged in making a difference. Dr. Lawson, I know that there's so much more, and we will talk about what you've done, your background, but I just know you as a person with a deep heart to make sure, a large heart to make sure that the community that in need is getting their needs met. And this book is just yet another voice that says, here's how we need to meet the needs of an African American population. Again, it is entitled African American Health: Peeling Back the Layers for a Vision of the Future. Dr. Lawson, welcome to Profound Conversations.
Thank you, and really great to see some of my old friends that I've known throughout the years, bringing back many, many, many exciting, pleasant memories. Bad news is that a lot of the issues that we raised in the distant past, I thought I can throw away my papers, I can throw away my talks, I can throw away everything else as we move forward. But now I am getting back into pulling back those papers, pulling back those talks, pulling back those articles. And essentially, the good news, I don't have to rewrite them because everything that was said then is now very applicable now. It's sad to see that we constantly are reviewing that which we've done before. I encourage you to read my next book, What the Slave Masters Taught Us, and based on the idea that when we were brought here, it was thought that it was we were gaining a technological advantage, but in reality, we were learning ways to remain as people of slavery, rather than as significant contributors to America. And yet, the free labor that this country has gained from us, what we think is, I'm convinced, is a basis for why this country exceeded many others. The issue that I am very concerned about is one that started, and I'm going way back now, when I was 10 years old at a state hospital in Petersburg, Virginia, which was the first hospital that was mental hospital used for African Americans. Remember looking down at the patients being washed with water hoses, and that stuck in my mind. And later, and I think that watching that experience laid the foundation for my much later switch in my career from being an animal researcher in psychology into a psychiatrist, to be able to do what I can to address some of the, not only mental health, but the general health needs of our community. And again, and this book, I think, is one culmination of that, resulting from my own experience later on, becoming involved with the National Medical Association, which is the oldest African American organization of physicians in the country, which developed because this country at the time, at one time, would not, until actually the 1960s, wouldn't allow African American physicians to be have membership, and you had to have membership if you wanted to have hospital privileges. So the NMA later developed a professional organization, and then a journal of which I was the editor. And this book is essentially some of the articles that I wrote about during that time as an editor. And I have to say, unfortunately, some of those articles are still very much relevant to what's going on now.
And also, you have over 200 publications, right? And so you well written. You have worked in Arkansas. You worked all over this country. You introduced something early on that is near to me. That is the enslaving of the minds of a population. And though this will be aired beyond February, but we're at the tail end of February, Black History Month, and Dr. Carter G. Woodson says that when you control a man's thinking, you don't worry about his actions. You don't tell him to come here, to go there. He will find his place and he will stay in it. You tell him to go to the back door. In fact, if there is no back door, he will make one for his own benefit. His education, his training, his indoctrination, his brainwashing makes it necessary. Until you speak to this idea of how a population was brought here and still are enslaved from a continent called Africa. It is prophetic. And you also say that years of doing the work, laboring in the fields, and much of what is here remains with us. So we're going to unpack some of that. So I'm excited about the upcoming book because that is very much on point about what one learned from those that thought that they were owning someone else. And so let us look at this. Let's talk about the NMA for a moment, because I think that's important. The idea of self-determination. You say this organization started in large part, was started because of what? The idea of not being able to have a voice in a space where people were being mistreated health-wise. Tell us more about the history of NMA.
Well, I emerged at a time, one of the interesting things is it was recognized very early that Black folks and white folks got the same diseases. And the question was, who was going to treat Black people? And courageous physicians, courageous folks went out and got an education to develop medicine at a time when African Americans were not allowed, especially states like Virginia, to read or write. And yet some of us did go out to get that knowledge. We often were not able to get the latest in terms of medical care. The idea was that the African continent had made no significant contribution. If you go back, you look at my colleague, Richard Williams, who did review that, found out that certain treatments that we now have actually developed from the continent, such as was developed by as vaccinations, as brain surgery, a number of modern technology is a direct result of what existed in the continent. And we're now again, historically, we'll find that African civilization is much older than we thought and much more advanced than we ever thought. And people are still struck at the discoveries that were made that we're just now beginning to appreciate. As one person said at the science fiction writer Arthur Clarke said, that we had built on what was developed in Egypt and Kush and other countries. We'll be in the stars now, rather than just getting to the moon. So a lot of what we developed was not built upon. In fact, we were thought to be an inferior species. The idea that Black folks had no mind was long perpetuated. Unfortunately, many African Americans were taught that. I still get young people who I say, let's study, see what we can do with math, let's see what we can do with physics, let's see what we can do with healthcare, and they say, that's not for me. Now, I see kids 5 feet tall say they want to become another Michael Jordan. Yet at the same time, they have much more chance of becoming a physician or a psychologist. So the part of it is that we were taught very early, and during slavery times it made sense. They needed cheap labor, they got it, but they didn't want the slaves to rebel. And so, as we know, they restricted not only education, but books such as the Bible were actually pulled apart to make what we call the slave Bible, because it talked about things like revolution and Moses and so forth. So early on, we were taught that one, you did not rebel, and two, that you had no history that was of significance to the larger world. And again, these ideas persisted long after slavery ended. And I can enumerate, as many of us already do, already recognize that we're taught that we're incapable of having minds that think. And yet, I'm from Virginia, and I didn't know at the time when I was going to school that Dr. Johnson, right up the road from me, was being used to map the orbits as John Glenn when he was orbiting the Earth. They recognized, the people who needed recognized that African Americans had the intellect to do these things, and yet we were not given credit for it, and we were not given recognition to it. We recognize
this is heavy, right? Because you speak about the oxymoron, right, of this process that you're benefiting from the genius of a population, and yet you were saying that they don't have intellect. You said that individuals, in an act of self-determination, create an organization to make sure that not only could they treat people like them, but then express their genius. You mentioned that medicine goes way back, right? We know that in the Ebers Papyrus, as it is called, there's a discussion about not only mental health, a discussion about diabetes, how to treat that, discussion about the guinea worm disease, right? Eyes and eye treatment. And so this is something that has been a part of the African genius for a long time. And this is the Ebers Papyrus. And this goes back, some say 1800 BCE, right? Ebers Papyrus and others, and it's 1500 BC before Christ era, Christian era. So this genius that is there is in the DNA. And now we have children not believing in themselves because they've been conditioned to see themselves as being inferior. Powerful piece. And so we're so thankful for the NMA challenging that and for your work to facilitate that process. And that's why I like this idea of furthering the vision, right, of this African genius process. Now, in your book, you talk about a variety of things. So thematically, what you're talking about in this book deals with, as it's entitled, peeling back the layers, right? African American health. What is it that we should know, right, about your writings, about peeling back the layers for vision? Because you speak about the idea of not being able to see, so peeling the layers. What do we need to know about African American health for the future?
Now, we should look at the issue of disparities. Why is it that our care is not as adequate as it should be? We're in one of the most technologically advanced places in the country, and yet our medical care, frankly, is inferior. That we do not have access, not only to providers, the number of African American physicians has not changed in the last 50, 60 years.
No
the
change.
Same number of doctors that were there in the turn of the century is the same number, especially African American men, as now. That the kinds of access to treatment is not there. If you look at, I had the fortune of being in D.C., but also in Austin, Texas. Austin, Texas has the reputation of being one of the healthiest places in the country, fastest growing city. But we went there, and I was startled to see that the African American community, there were no hospitals, there were no physicians, even though I was part of health development, a new medical school there. And I said, wow, how can this be? This must be unique. But then I came back to DC and found out that if you look at the area in what we call Ward 3 and 5, we have several. DC has 4 medical schools right in the area, and a number of physicians. But if you go out Ward 7 and 8, where many African Americans live, there are no medical. There is limited access to the medical schools, and the didn't have any hospitals. And many of the physicians who wanted to practice there had to really had to come from other areas because there were a lack of resources for healthcare. So even in today, when we look at areas such as D.C., New York City, and others, and look at the African American community, there are certain things that aren't there. One of them is healthcare providers, and the other there is healthcare facilities. Why that is again, I trace it all the way back to slavery, but we also had zoning rules, redlining, other kinds of things that kept certain things out of African American communities. We have wealthy African American communities that are basically places where people live, but they cannot have services. It's well known. We do not have grocery stores in many of our communities. We do not have fruits and vegetables, even though African Americans just in the U.S. have disproportionately high elevated blood pressure. We do not have these kinds of services that are necessary to maintain good health, and we see this persisting gap in terms of life expectancy and health care, not because people are deliberately trying to keep themselves sick, but because we're set in a system in which poor health is maintained. And as a result of that, we have problems that are persisting, such as diabetes, hypertension. I can go on and on and on. Many cancers, heart disease that are more common in the African American community. Is it because folks don't want to take care of themselves? No, it's because it's not very accessible. We have to work hard to stay healthy. Is it because lack of knowledge? Well, we often don't, many of our folks have what I call health illiteracy. And part of it is not because of people making themselves ignorant, but because of the system, we were taught that many of the health practices that are important are not important for us. And they were useful when we were slaves. Slaves, they had to eat a lot of fat and a lot of high carbohydrates for energy, because you had to work all day. So that when it changed and we had somebody sit at the desk try to do something intellectually, it just that what we ate was was actually toxic in terms of that lifestyle. That we were taught very early that if you're working for someone else. You're working for the slave master. All your resources went to the slave master. And what the slave quickly learned is that to last long and live a life, you had to set yourself up so that you tried to do as little work as possible, because you didn't. Many folks still aren't convinced that the fruits of their labor is going, and it doesn't go to our community. Instead, it go to the larger community, which many times does not come back to our institution. And it shows up in the other cultures, Asian cultures, Latino cultures, in which their fruits of their labor stay within their community, their economic might, and it recirculates. Whereas in the African American community, fruits of our labor leave our community so that our community stay poverty stricken.
So it's again, powerful piece. So Ward 8, of course, for example, in Washington, D.C., has entered the house of Frederick Douglass, and he was deemed at one point to be the president of the Black community. And you said that there's no access to health care there. And yet people are living just knowing about D.C. who will not even travel across the bridge to go into from Southeast D.C. to want to travel over to upper Northwest to go for medical treatment, or even down to Foggy Bottom to George Washington GW. So there's this a situation by which you said a population does not have a desire to have ill health, but because of social cultural conditions, On top of that, you said that the dietary process, the dietary consumption habits or attitudes that we have, many of them have been shaped by the enslavement experience, where there was a high need for fats and carbohydrates to do labor. And then you compound that with systemic racism and oppression that increases cortisol level within the body, that influences how plaque builds up in the arteries, which influences, of course, coronary heart disease. And all of these things are a part of a prescription for ill health. And then you say our attitudes about disease has to be checked. I think, Dr. Lawson, that is profound. And I know this is a part of the work that you uncover in your book. I think that we hear this and then we get duped by some illusion of inclusion. We believe that somehow things have changed and we don't keep pressing forward. But you have been one of those who have pressed forward and to make sure that we know, one, that we know who we are, that we know that we are tied to a legacy of greatness. And secondly, that we are important enough to be able to speak about, to speak on, and to treat, to bring about health changes. Now, in your book, there's so much more that's talked about throughout the history of the National Medical Association. It focuses primarily on health issues related to African Americans and underserved populations. However, the principal goal of the initiative was to make sure that all people were able to receive something of value and worth. What has been the most alarming health disparity within the Black community that you've seen, and how have you, and in your work, how have you sought to address that disparity?
Two of them. One of them is homicide, and one is suicide. Homicide rates have been traditionally high in the African American community. Why is that occurring? I'm missing the point that at one point it was illegal to study factors that led to homicide. And there was Congress simply said you should not, you can't study it. Similarly, suicide is sort of a marked increase. It used to be that young African Americans were a low rate of suicide. Now we've become at the same rate as Native Americans in terms of the group that has the highest rate of suicide. Again, the issues that contribute to it include the availability of things such as fentanyl and other drugs of abuse. Question often becomes, is it suicide or is it just folks making an error in terms of taking these drugs? And why is it? Why did homicide, suicide, anxiety, and depression all go up together at the end of the COVID crisis? And I think that it's all interrelated, and that is that the COVID experience exacerbated existing lack of access to not only physical health for treatment, but also mental health treatment, that folks often found that they had not only limited resources, but also limited access to those things that give life purpose and meaning. And those contribute to a large extent to ongoing problems in terms of homicide and suicide. When I was growing up, you look at TV, all you saw were white faces. Now, again, you look at our leadership in our country, all you see are white faces. In between that, there was a gap in which there was an attempt to try to show that we could be and accomplish a lot by showing that there was diversity. Now the concept of diversity is considered almost an evil process. So all of these factors are contributing to creating an institutional belief that we are irrelevant, unimportant, and that we are victimizing ourselves rather than a result of a larger system that is promoting the idea that rather than that we should be productive, that we should really just be consumers who destroy ourselves.
Dr. Lawson, you mentioned that the suicide rate among African Americans has increased, though the population comprises of about 13.6% in the United States. There has been an increase among African Americans 5.5 per 100 in 2011 to 7.7 per 100,000 in 2020. And you mentioned the contributing factor could have been, of course, COVID, but there's been a marked increase in suicide among people of African descent. And it's not necessarily because suicide ideations weren't there, but something has come to unmask it. What I think is so important here in this conversation is that there has been a community that has had a variety of barriers, of offenses, of things pressed against it that has been untreated. And some want to call it, Dr. Jordan Gu talks about post-traumatic slave syndrome. I call it persistent enslavement systemic trauma. It's an ongoing process of being traumatized, working from can't see in the morning to can't see at night, being beaten, sodomized, brutalized, right? Again, working under horrific conditions and never having that checked. And that is also something that influences health and health outcomes. You mentioned being in Austin, Texas. And so I know that there's also discussion about zip codes, that Blacks can live in the same area with an affluent population and have the occurrence of ill health and the occurrence of suicide as that of an impoverished population. So when we talk about peeling back the layers for a vision, what is our vision? What is the vision that we should have moving forward post-COVID into the era of optimal health for people of African descent? What do we do? What do we think about?
What we have to do is look at what helped us to survive thus far. We've developed a number of strategies in adverse situations that help us to keep us going. But at the same time, to go beyond that, to try to understand how we are, where we are from our perspective. We got to make sure that we have the knowledge, the ability to access this knowledge and the information so that we can learn from what our ancestors were familiar with, but also some of the advances that's occurring now in terms of medicine, society, and history. So we have the advantage of being able to integrate that all together if that is our motive. And so we have to look at developing our strengths in the context of our very unique experience, and recognize for what it is, that simply adopting the behaviors of the larger culture may not be in our best interest, but at the same time, isolating ourselves from the advances that has been made in the larger culture can be just as destructive as well. So we need to do the positive of developing within ourselves the skills to move forward. Other groups have done this historically. We need to do it as well in order to maintain our survival and our strength.
Powerful. So look at the things that we've done in the past to get where we are. And I think that is an important point to recognize, that you too often, as you said, we're spending our time trying to imitate or be like someone else that may actually be working against our health. Because if the population that has worked against us instituted an entire system that is designed for our servitude and ultimately our demise, then to have that system means that we are also participating in our own demise at the same time. A profound point. What did we do to get over? One of the things was to maintain some sense of community, to recognize the power of community, to pull together one to another, because there were no other options that one had to pull to. That's why you have in the Black community even now plate cousins and fake play mothers and so forth and so on, because people came together in community. Because sometimes people will be sold from a child be sold from one plantation to the next, and somebody's child will go to the next. And so the person doesn't know where their child is, but they start taking care of their child as if it were their own. That's something to honor. There were also, as you mentioned, a recognition of ways of healing, of being. If African Americans came up with smallpox, what else were they talking about in those spaces? And so we know that there are records that indicate to us that various treatments for various ailments came from the enslaved African population because they brought that genius with them. So understanding how to return back to the genius of being healthy and whole. And the third point is to recognize something is an operation that's greater than oneself. No matter where you find African people, there's an acknowledgement of a divine process, and that divine is not external to one's being, it is internal. And my grandmother would say, you have to be who you is and not who you ain't, because if you try to be who you ain't gonna be nobody. And so what you said very clearly is being who you are, being authentic, acknowledging that there's some unique issues that we must address, acknowledge that we have a legacy of greatness to return to and to draw from, and to begin to live in the profundity of one's truth is where we find the greatest health, healing, and restoration. Dr. Lawson, the last word is on you on Profound Conversations. We're out. We're done. Whatever you have to say, close us out, and that's it.
I think the important thing, shows like this is very important and should be more widely distributed in our community. Let us know that there is another message other than that of the larger society that shows that we can move forward and that we can develop a better community.
Profound Conversations with Dr. William Lawson, a legend. People, if you don't know it, you just heard from a library, one that is filled with knowledge, but also experiences that can facilitate health and healing. And when this book says peeling back the layers for a vision for the future, we must listen to this legend because he has a vision that has been given to him that we need to hold on to so we can have a better future. Thank you.
Thank you.